Good day, students. This is Mr. Mark Joseph B. Badillo, and welcome to this subject, Earth Science. For this day, we are going to begin this subject and to make an overview for this subject. So first is, we are going to make an overview for this subject, but before we proceed in our discussion, let me present to you our essential learning competencies that will serve as our main objectives for this discussion. So first is, I'm going to discuss the overview of the subject, and second, we are going to define the meaning and purpose of earth science. And lastly, we are going to understand the significance of earth science in the study of the natural world. What is earth science? Do you have any idea about earth science? What comes into your mind when you hear earth science? When we say earth science or even geosciences, is the study of the earth's structure, properties, processes, and 4.5 billion years of biotic evolution. Again, students, when we say earth science, it is the study of the earth's structure, properties, processes, and 4.5 billion years of biotic evolution. Understanding this phenomena is essential to maintenance of life on the planet. Why we study earth science? We rely on earth for valuable resources such as soil, water, metals, industrial minerals, and even energy. And we need to know how to find these resources and exploit them sustainability. We can study rocks and the fossils they contain to understand the evolution of our environment and the life within it. Geosciences, meteorology, and even the study of life or the interactions among environment is also connected to the subject earth science. We have two units in this subject. So first is we have unit 1, Earth's origin and composition, and the second unit or the last unit that we have on this subject is unit 2, entitled as Earth's processes and history. So first is unit 1, Earth's origin and composition. Humankind has always been curious as to what makes up the universe and how it was created. There are countless theories have been put up to try to answer questions regarding in the nature and mysteries of the cosmos in an attempt to understand how the universe began. Did you know understanding how the universe began helps in learning about Earth and its beginning and even the processes? Earth science is an exciting branch of science with many interesting and practical applications. Let's start with Chapter 1, the origin and structure of the Earth. This chapter provides an overview on the origins of the universe and of Earth, and also it relates how the unique characteristics of Earth are important in sustaining life on Earth. So, we are going to encounter the lessons in this chapter and about theories on the origin of the universe, the origin of the solar system, the life on Earth, or lastly, the Earth subsystems. This chapter describes the historical development of the theories that explain the origin of the universe, and also this chapter presents the hypothesis explaining the origin of the universe and also the solar system, and it describes the unique characteristics of Earth's that necessary to support life, and lastly, it explains the characteristics of Earth that consist of four subsystems across whose boundaries matter and energy flow. So let's discuss this chapter 2 entitled as Rocks and Minerals. This chapter presents minerals, rocks and rock cycle, classification of rocks, and also the ore and minerals. This chapter classifies rocks as igneous, sedimentary, or even metamorphic, and it identifies common rock-forming minerals using their physical and chemical properties, and also it identifies economically the importance of minerals, and lastly it describes how our minerals are found, mined, and processed for human use. The next chapter that we have is all about energy resources that will serve as our chapter 3. So this chapter presents the sources of energy, the fossil fuels, nuclear energy, geothermal energy, hydroelectric energy, wind and solar energy, and the biomass. This chapter describes how fossil fuels are formed, and also it explains how heat from beneath Earth is tapped as source of energy, or even what we call the geothermal for human use. It explains how energy is harnessed from flowing water, or even what we call the hydroelectric power plant or hydroelectric energy. And also it cites ways to address the different environmental concerns related to the use of fossil fuels, geothermal energy, and hydroelectric energy. So next is chapter 4, Water Resources. This chapter talks about the water on Earth, the Earth's water, and water as resources. It recognizes how water is distributed on Earth, and also it identifies the various water resources on Earth, and it explains how different activities affect the quality and availability of water for human use. And also, we can suggest ways of conserving and protecting water resources. So next chapter that we have is all about chapter 5, Soil and Mud. This chapter talks about the pedosphere and the soil and soil quality. It recognizes also what soil is and why it is an important resources, and it identifies human activities such as farming, construction of structures, and waste disposal that affects the quality and quantity of soil, and it enumerates ways of conserving and protecting the soil for future generations. On the last chapter that we have on this subject, it's all about human activities and environment. It describes how people generate different types of waste as they use various materials and resources, and this chapter explains how different types of waste affects people's health and the environment. This chapter presents the ecosystem service and the role of ecosystem, and also the human activities, waste, and waste management. The next unit that we have on this chapter is what we call the Earth's processes and history. We all know that Earth is continuously affected by forces that cause changes within Earth as what we call the endogenous processes. And above the surface is what we call the exogenous processes. Take down notes take down notes, students, the important details that I mentioned. These processes affects and are affected by the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere, and have driven rock and mineral formation, geomorphological processes, volcanism, plate movement, tectonic and seismic movement of Earth for thousands of years. This unit provides in-depth of discussions of these processes that have shaped and will continue to shape the Earth. The next, so we have the first chapter in this unit rather is what we call the exogenic processes that will serve as our chapter 7. This chapter describes how rocks undergo weathering, and it explains how the products of weathering are carried away by erosion and deposited elsewhere. And also it explains how rocks and soil move downslope due to the direct action of the gravity. It presents weathering, erosion and transport, and lastly, the deposition. Next chapter that we have is all about chapter 8, Endogenic Processes. This chapter presents magma and volcanism, earthquake, deposition, metamorphism. And also it explains why the Earth's interior is hot. It describes how magma is formed. It describes what happens after magma is formed. It describes how rocks behave under different types of stress such as compression, pulling apart, and shearing. And lastly, it describes the changes in mineral components and texture of rocks due to changes in pressure and temperature, or what we call the metamorphism. On the next chapter that we have is all about chapter 9, Plate Tectonics. This chapter identifies and differentiates the layers of Earth. It describes the continental drift theory. It discusses the evidence that support continental drift theory, and it explains how seafloor spreads, and it describes the structure and evolution of ocean basins and basins. And lastly, it explains how the movement of plates leads to the formation of faults, trenches, volcanoes, rift valleys, and mountain ranges. This chapter presents the internal structure of the Earth, which is the 4 layers of Earth, which is the crust, mantle, outer core, and inner core. This chapter also presents the continental drift theory that was proposed by Alfred Wegener, and also the seafloor spreading and the plate tectonics. On the next chapter that we have on this unit is all about chapter 10, the history of Earth. This chapter presents the stratigraphy and relative ages. Next to it is the absolute dating, the fossil and the geological time scale, and the Earth's history in geological time. It presents how layers of stratified rocks are formed. It describes the different methods of determining the age of stratified rocks, and it explains how relative and absolute dating were used to determine the subdivisions of geologic time. And also it describes how index fossils or guide fossils are used to define and identify subdivisions of the geological time scale. And lastly, it describes the history of Earth through geological time. What do I expect? First is, you should take down notes about the important details that is presented in the lesson. And also, you should study your lessons and avoid distractions and focus on learning. I think that's for all for today's discussion. Again, this is Mr. Mark Joseph B. Badilio. Thank you for listening. If you have questions or even clarifications, you can message me directly on my account